1 year after the human fleet had first entered Serani space, the war was over. The Kreth Dominion had fallen, and Warlord Skrath was dead, and 23 species that had known nothing but slavery now breathed free air for the first time in generations. The galaxy had changed, and everyone knew it. Serani Prime had been rebuilt, and the cities that had burned were rising again, and the orchards that had been destroyed were blooming with new life. Council Alderon stood in the great plaza of the capital and looked up at the monument that had been erected in the center. It was a simple structure made of crystal and light, and it showed a human hand reaching down to lift up a fallen figure. The inscription at the base was written in every language of the freed peoples. They heard us crying, and they came. Today was the day of the ceremony, and representatives from across the galaxy had gathered to witness something that had never happened before: the founding of the Rapid Response Compact. Admiral Quan Dason stood at the podium, and her voice carried across the plaza to the millions watching on screens throughout known space. "We are not here to celebrate victory," she said. "We are here to make a promise. From this day forward, no cry for help will go unanswered. Any species that joins this compact pledges to respond when others suffer. We will not calculate value or strategic worth. We will simply come." The Serani were the first to sign, and Naram pressed his thin fingers to the document with tears streaming down his face. Then came the Veloshi, who had been slaves of the Kreth for 800 years. Then came the Morthan rebels, who had overthrown their own empire's complicity. Then came species after species, until the list numbered in the dozens. The Galactic Council watched in stunned silence as the balance of power shifted before their eyes. This was not an alliance built on trade or military advantage or political calculation. This was something new. This was an alliance built on the simple promise that no one would ever scream into the void alone again. Captain Yoon Sao-jin did not attend the ceremony. She had resigned her commission 3 days earlier, and she stood now on a hillside overlooking the Serani capital with a small bag over her shoulder. Dharan found her there as the celebrations continued below. "You are leaving," he said. "My part is done," Yoon replied. "Others will carry it forward now. Where will you go?" Yoon looked up at the sky, where ships from 100 worlds moved among the stars. "Home, maybe. I have not seen Earth in a long time. I want to walk in forests that were not burned, and swim in oceans that were not poisoned. I want to remember what peace feels like." Dharan reached into his robe and withdrew a small crystal box. "The Serani Council asked me to give you this." Yoon opened the box, and inside was a crystal vial filled with shimmering silver liquid. "What is it?" "The preserved tears of 10,000 survivors," Dharan said softly. "From the day you arrived, from the day hope returned, we wanted you to know that you are never forgotten, that what you did will echo through our history forever." Yoon held the vial, and her hands trembled. "We did not do it for gratitude, Dharan. I know. And that is why the gratitude matters. You asked nothing, and so we give everything." They stood together in silence as the sun set over the rebuilt city. "Can I tell you something?" Yoon said finally. "Of course. When we received your distress signal, I was afraid. Not of the battle, but of what it would mean if we did not go. I was afraid we would become the species that heard screaming and looked away. I was afraid we would become what we hate most about ourselves." Dharan nodded slowly. "And now I know we made the right choice. Not because we won, or because we saved your people, or because the Dominion fell, but because I can look at myself and know I did not look away. That is worth more than any victory." Lieutenant Commander Park My-Ray had stayed behind to oversee the final transition of humanitarian operations to local authorities. She walked through the streets of the capital and smiled at the Serani children who waved at her from windows and doorways. They had never known the war as anything but a terrible memory, and they would grow up in a galaxy where help could come when you needed it most. She found Sergeant Baek Junho sitting in a small garden near the Memorial Plaza. He looked tired, but there was peace in his eyes that she had not seen in months. How are you, Junho? Beak looked up at the sky where human ships were beginning their long journey home. I keep thinking about that first day when we pulled those children from the rubble. They were so scared. They thought we were more monsters come to hurt them. And now they run up to human soldiers and ask for treats and stories. They are not afraid anymore. We gave them that. Park sat beside him, and they watched the ships rise into the twilight. Was it worth it? She asked quietly. Beak was silent for a long moment. I lost friends in this war. I saw things that will haunt me until I die. I will carry scars inside and out for the rest of my life. He turned to look at her, and his eyes were bright. But when I close my eyes now, I do not hear the screaming anymore. I hear laughter. I hear children playing in streets that used to be rubble. I hear singing from species that have forgotten what joy sounded like. He smiled, and it was the first real smile Park had seen from him in a year. Yeah, it was worth it. 3 months later, a new distress signal reached compact space. It came from the outer rim, where a species called the Vuruth had been attacked by raiders, and their colonies were burning, and their children were dying. The signal was weak and desperate, and filled with the same terror that the Serani had broadcast a year before. But this time, the response was different. Within hours, 12 different species had mobilized. Their fleets and medical ships and rescue teams, the Serani sent 5 hospital vessels crewed entirely by volunteers who had once been refugees themselves. The message went out on all frequencies. Vareth people, this is the Rapid Response Compact. We heard you crying. We are on our way. Hold on. Darren listened to the broadcast from his office on Serani Prime, and he wept. Not from sadness, but from something he could not name. Oh, perhaps of gratitude. Or the simple profound joy of knowing that the universe had changed. He thought of Captain Yoon, and he wondered if she was watching the stars. Tonight he thought of the humans who had come when no one else would, and he understood at last what made them different. They were not stronger or smarter or more advanced than other species. They were simply people who remembered what it felt like to suffer alone. And they had decided that no one should ever feel that way again. Deathworlders did not offer help. They sent fleets, and the galaxy would never be the same. The Galactic Council chamber on station. Veridax was filled with angry voices and accusations. Fleet Admiral Quan Dason stood alone at the center of the great circular room, while representatives from 40 different species looked down at her. From their elevated platforms, the Morthani ambassador spoke first, and his deep voice echoed through the chamber. Humanity has violated 17 different treaties by engaging in unauthorized military action. You had no right to intervene in Kreth territorial operations. Quan kept her face calm and her hands clasped behind her back. The Serani were not Kreth territory. They were an independent civilization being slaughtered. The Veleshi representative leaned forward with his tentacles writhing in agitation. The Serani had no defense pact with humanity. You had no obligation to assist them. Your actions have destabilized regional security and threatened the peace we have worked so hard to maintain. Peace, Quan repeated, and there was ice in her voice. Is that what you call it when millions die and everyone watches in silence? Ambassador Sin of the Kreth. Dominion rose from his seat, and his red eyes burned with hatred. The humans have committed an act of war. We demand reparations for our destroyed fleet and the return of our rightful territory. The Serani belong to us by right of conquest. Quan turned to face him directly. No one belongs to anyone by right of conquest. That is not a concept humanity recognizes. The chamber erupted in confused murmurs because conquest was the foundation of galactic politics, and it was how empires rose and fell, and how borders were drawn. The idea that a species would reject it entirely was incomprehensible. The council arbiter called for order, and then addressed Quan with barely concealed frustration. Admiral, humanity is a young species in galactic terms. Perhaps you do not understand how things work here. When a stronger power claims territory, the weaker power submits. This is the natural order. With respect, Arbiter, Quan replied, we understand perfectly. We simply reject it. On what grounds? Quan reached into her uniform pocket and withdrew a small device. I would like to play something for the council. Before anyone could object, she activated the device, and the Serani distress signal filled the chamber. The screaming came first, and it was raw and desperate and filled with terror. Then came the voices begging for help in broken Galactic standard. Then came the sound of children crying as explosions thundered in the background. The council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and some looked away, and some closed their eyes. The recording continued for 3 full minutes, and by the end several representatives were visibly shaken. Quan let the silence stretch before she spoke. Every species in this room received this signal. Every one of you heard those screams and calculated whether the Serani were worth saving. You decided they were not. She swept her gaze across the chamber and her eyes were hard. We did not calculate. We simply heard suffering and we came. The Morthani ambassador recovered first, and his voice was defensive. Sentiment cannot guide policy. If we intervened every time a species faced conquest, we would be at war constantly. And yet you are not at war constantly. Quan replied, you simply watch and do nothing and tell yourselves it is wisdom. Ambassador Sin slammed his fist against his console. This is outrageous. Humanity has no authority here. You are children playing at being a galactic power. We will crush you as we crush the Serani. You are welcome to try. Quan said calmly. The threat hung in the air, and everyone in the chamber felt the temperature drop on Serani Prime Lieutenant Commander Park. Myray was coordinating the largest humanitarian operation in human history. Ships landed constantly bringing food and medicine and building materials, and thousands of volunteers who had left their homes to help strangers. Park had not slept properly in weeks, but she could not stop because every time she closed her eyes, she saw the faces of the survivors. She was reviewing supply manifests when Sergeant Beek Junho entered her makeshift command center. He looked haunted and older than his years. Commander, we found something in the Eastern District. You need to see this. Park followed him through the ruined city until they reached a large facility that had been heavily guarded by Kreth forces. Inside she found rows of cages and processing equipment, and the remains of Serani who had been reduced to nothing more than biological materials. She stared at the horror before her, and her stomach turned. What is this? She whispered. Beek's voice was hollow. The Kreth were not just conquering them, Commander. They were harvesting them. The Serani were being processed as food. Park had to lean against a wall to stay upright. She had known the Kreth were cruel, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. How many facilities like this are there? We have found 7 so far. We estimate thousands of Serani were processed before we arrived. Park closed her eyes and let the rage wash through her. When she opened them again, her jaw was set, and her voice was steel. Document everything. I want visual evidence sent to Admiral Quan immediately. If the Council wants to defend the Kreth, after seeing this, let them try. The evidence reached the Galactic Council within hours, and the reaction was immediate. Species that had supported the Kreth position fell silent, and those who had demanded human withdrawal found themselves unable to speak. Ambassador Sin tried to dismiss the images as fabrication, but no one believed him. The Serani were farmers and artists and historians, and the Kreth had been eating them. Councillor Daron addressed the council for the first time, and his voice trembled with grief and fury. You ask why humanity came. You ask what right they had to interfere. I ask you this instead. What right did you have to ignore us? What kind of civilization watches children be devoured and calls it peace? The chamber was silent. Daron turned to face Admiral Quan, and he bowed deeply in the Serani gesture of profound gratitude. Humanity came when no one else would. They asked nothing and demanded nothing. They simply fought for us because we were hurting. I do not care what your treaties say. I know what honor looks like. I know what compassion looks like. And I know that Deathworlders are the only ones in this galaxy who understand that some things are worth fighting for. Admiral Kwan bowed in return. We will not stop, she said. We will not leave until every Serani is safe and every Kreth is driven from the system. And if the Dominion wishes to respond, we will be waiting, Ambassador. Sim stormed from the chamber, and everyone knew what was coming. War was inevitable now, but for the first time in galactic history, it would be fought not for territory or resources or power. It would be fought because someone had been crying, and humanity had refused to look away. The Kreth Dominion had ruled through fear for 3,000 years, and they had never known defeat. Until now, 4 months after the liberation of Serani Prime, the human fleet crossed into Dominion space and the galaxy held its breath. Captain Yoon Seojin stood on the bridge of the relentless dawn and watched the stars streak past as a ship led the vanguard of the largest military campaign in human history. They were not here for conquest, and they were not here for vengeance, and they were here because the Kreth had enslaved dozens of species across hundreds of worlds, and every single one of them had been crying for help. The same message played on every frequency as the human fleet advanced. To all enslaved peoples of the Kreth Dominion, we are coming, hold on. You are not alone anymore. Counselor Theron sat in the observation lounge and watched the endless darkness of space. He had asked to accompany the fleet as a liaison and cultural advisor, and Captain Yoon had agreed without hesitation. In the months since the liberation, Theron had learned more about humans than he had learned about any species in his long life. They were contradictions wrapped in mysteries. They could be gentle enough to weep over a dying child, and fierce enough to tear through enemy lines without mercy. They sang songs about love and wrote poems about flowers and then built weapons, capable of cracking planets, and underneath all of it was a wound that never fully healed. Theron had read their histories, and he had seen the chapters they called their greatest shamas. The genocides and the famines and the wars where millions died while others turned away. Those memories drove them forward like a fuel that never ran out. Captain Yoon entered the observation lounge and sat beside him. You should sleep, Counselor. We have a long campaign ahead. Theron turned to look at her, and he saw the exhaustion in her eyes and the weight on her shoulders. I cannot stop thinking about what you told me, he said, about why your people came for us. What about it? You said, you remember what it felt like to scream into the void and hear nothing. But you also said your species was the one who caused some of that suffering. Yoon was quiet for a long moment. That is true. We have been both the victim and the villain. We know what it looks like from both sides. And that is why you fight. Now, we fight because we refuse to become the ones who ignore the screaming. We have been that before. We know how easy it is to look away and tell ourselves it is not our problem. Every time we save someone else, we save ourselves a little too. Theron felt something shift in his understanding. The humans were not fighting because they were noble or pure or better than other species. They were fighting because they were terrified of what they might become if they stopped. That fear was a gift. On the border world of Kreth, Station 7 Warlord Skrath prepared for the battle he knew was coming. He had gathered the largest fleet the Dominion had ever assembled, and he had fortified every position, and he had planned for every scenario. But deep in his heart, he knew it would not be enough. The humans did not fight like any enemy he had ever faced. They did not seek favorable odds or strategic advantage or diplomatic compromise. They simply came, and they kept coming. And they would not stop until they had freed every slave in the Dominion. His second in command approached with a data tablet. My lord, we are receiving reports from the 7th province. The slave populations are rising up. They believe the humans will save them. Skrath crushed the tablet in his claws. Then we will make examples of them. Broadcast public executions. Show them what happens to those who hope. The executions were broadcast across the Dominion and, for a few hours, the uprising slowed. Then the human fleet arrived at the 7th province and liberated every world in 3 days. The uprisings returned stronger than before. Hope was spreading faster than the Dominion could kill it. The first major engagement came at the fortress of Cries Prime, and it was the largest space battle in recorded galactic history. 2,000 Cries warships faced 300 human vessels, and the Dominion commanders laughed at the odds. They stopped laughing when the battle began. Human ships moved with coordinated precision, and their weapons struck with devastating accuracy, and their pilots flew with a reckless courage that bordered on madness. But it was not madness, and it was something the Cries could not understand. It was purpose. Every human in that fleet knew exactly why they were fighting, and they knew exactly what they were protecting, and that certainty made them unstoppable. The battle lasted 18 hours, and when it ended, the Cries had lost over half their fleet, while the humans had lost 43 ships. Warlord Scrath retreated to his final stronghold, and he felt the Empire crumbling around him. In the aftermath, Yoon walked through the medical bay of the relentless dawn, and she stopped at every bed to speak with the wounded. A young pilot named Kim Hannah had lost her arm in the battle, and she looked up at her captain with tears in her eyes. "Did we win?" she asked. Yoon took her remaining hand and held it gently. "We won this battle, but the war is not over. There are still millions waiting to be freed." Kim managed a weak smile. "Then we keep going. Can you keep going?" Kim looked at the stump where her arm had been, and she did not flinch. "I keep hearing them, Captain. The signals we intercepted. All those people crying for help. I hear them when I close my eyes. I will keep going until I stop hearing them." Yoon squeezed her hand and said nothing because there was nothing to say. She heard them too. They all heard them, and they would not stop until the crying ended. Theron found Yoon later in her quarters, staring at a holographic map of the Dominion. "How much longer?" he asked. "Months, maybe a year at most. The Dominion is collapsing faster than we expected. When people believe help is coming, they find the strength to fight for themselves. You have changed everything," Theron said softly. "Not just for the Serani, but for the entire galaxy. Species that never dared to hope are rising up because they heard what you did for us." Yoon turned to face him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "We did not do it to change the galaxy, Theron. We did it because we heard you crying, and we could not bear to do nothing." "I know," Theron replied, "and that is exactly why it changed everything." Across the Dominion, the word spread like wildfire. The Deathworlders were coming, and they asked nothing, and they demanded nothing, and they simply came because someone was hurting. Slaves who had known nothing but chains for generations began to whisper about freedom, and the Cries, who had ruled through fear for 3,000 years, finally learned what it meant to be afraid. The battle for orbital supremacy lasted 7 hours, and when it ended, the Cries fleet was scattered and broken and fleeing toward the edge of the system. Captain Yoon Seo-jin had not slept in 30 hours, but she could not rest because there was still work to be done. The real mission was only beginning. Launch all rescue shuttles, she ordered, and her voice was hoarse but steady. "I want medical teams on the ground within the hour. Search and rescue squads deployed to the most damaged sectors first." Lieutenant Commander Park Myri coordinated the massive operation from her station, and she marveled at how quickly everything moved. Human ships were not just weapons of war, and they carried doctors and nurses and engineers and enough supplies to feed a city for months. This was not conquest, and this was not occupation. And this was something else entirely. On the surface of Serani Prime, the sun rose over a landscape of devastation. Sergeant First Class Beak Junho led his search and rescue squad through the rubble of what had once been a beautiful residential district. The buildings had collapsed from orbital strikes, and the streets were choked with debris, and the air smelled of smoke and death. Beak was a veteran of 3 campaigns. and he had seen terrible things in his years of service, but nothing had prepared him for this. The Serani were so fragile and so delicate, and they had clearly never known violence before. He found the first survivors huddled in the basement of a destroyed school, and there were 12 of them, and most were children. Their compound eyes were huge with fear, and their thin bodies trembled as the humans approached. Beak knelt down and removed his helmet so they could see his face. "You are safe now," he said slowly and clearly. "We are here to help you." One of the adult Serani stepped forward with shaking legs, and her voice was barely a whisper. "Why did you come? We have nothing to give you. We are nobody." Beak felt his heart crack at those words, and he had to take a breath before he could answer. "You were hurting," he said simply. That was enough. The Serani stared at him as if he had spoken in a language she could not understand. Her entire worldview was built on the idea that help came with a price, and that no one did anything for free, and that the weak were always abandoned. But here was this strange, terrifying creature from a death world, kneeling in the dust and offering kindness without asking anything in return. She began to cry, and her tears were silver in the morning light. Beak reached out and gently touched her shoulder, and he made a silent promise that he would find every survivor in the city, no matter how long it took. High above the planet, Councilor Darum was brought aboard the Relentless Dawn, and he walked through corridors filled with bustling activity. Humans rushed past him carrying medical supplies and equipment, and they nodded at him with tired smiles and kept moving. He had expected warriors and monsters, and what he found instead were people who looked exhausted and determined and deeply sad. Captain Yoon met him in a conference room, and she looked like she had not slept in days. "Councilor Daran," she said with a slight bow. "I am Captain Yoon Seo-jin. I apologize that we could not come sooner." Daran stared at her in disbelief. "You apologize," he repeated, and his voice cracked. "You came when no one else would, and you saved my people. And you apologize for not being faster." Yoon met his eyes, and there was no pride in her gaze, and no expectation of gratitude. "We should have been here on the first day. Every life lost since we received your signal weighs on us." Daran sank into a chair because his legs would no longer support him. "I do not understand you," he admitted. "I have lived for 200 cycles, and I have studied the histories of 100 species, and I have never encountered anyone like humans." Yoon sat across from him and folded her hands on the table. "We are not so different from others," she said. "We have our flaws and our failures and our dark chapters, but we also remember what it felt like to suffer alone." "What do you mean?" Yoon was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was heavy with old pain. "There was a time on our world when entire peoples were destroyed while others watched and did nothing. We call those times our greatest shamas. We swore we would never be the ones who look away." Daran listened, and something shifted inside him. He had always believed that the strong preyed on the weak because that was the natural order, and that compassion was a weakness that evolution would eventually eliminate. But these Deathworlders had built their entire civilization on a different principle. "You came because you remember suffering," Daran said slowly. "We came because silence is unbearable when you know what it feels like to scream into the void and hear nothing." Yoon replied. Down on the surface, Sergeant Beak and his team had worked through the day and into the night. They had pulled over 300 survivors from the rubble, and they had carried children in their arms, and they had held the hands of the dying. Beak was sitting on a pile of broken stone when Private Choi Yuna approached him with a canteen. "Sergeant, you need to drink something." Beak took the canteen, but he did not drink, and he just stared at the ruins around him. "I found a nursery today," he said quietly. "Most of them did not make it. They were so small, Yuna. So small." Choi sat beside him, and she did not say anything because there were no words that could help. They sat in silence as the stars came out overhead, and somewhere in the distance, a human medical shuttle landed with more supplies. The Serani were starting to emerge from hiding now, and they watched the humans with wonder and confusion and the first fragile seeds of trust. They had sent their cry into the void expecting nothing, and instead an entire fleet had answered. Warlord Scrath stood on the bridge of his damaged cruiser and watched Sarani Prime shrink in the rear viewport. He had lost 2/3 of his fleet and thousands of warriors, and he had gained nothing. The humans had not tried to negotiate, and they had not demanded payment, and they had simply attacked with a fury that defied all logic. Scrath did not understand, and that frightened him more than the defeat itself. "Send a message to the Dominion Council," he ordered. "Tell them the Deathworlders have gone mad. They fight for species that offer nothing. They die for strangers. This is not war as we know it." His second-in-command looked uncertain. "What should we tell them to do, my lord?" Scrath stared at the stars, and for the first time in his long and bloody life, he felt something like fear. "Tell them to be afraid," he said. "Tell them that any species that fights without reason cannot be predicted and cannot be controlled. Tell them the humans do not follow our rules." The message went out and across the Dominion. Thousands of Kreth heard it and wondered what kind of monsters they had awakened. But they were wrong about one thing. The humans were not monsters, and they were not mad, and they were simply people who refused to ignore suffering. And that made them more dangerous than any monster could ever be. The signal was weak and broken, and filled with screaming. Council of Duran pressed his thin fingers against the communication panel as fire raged outside the window of the emergency bunker, and his compound eyes reflected the orange glow of his dying world. 9 days ago, the Kreth Dominion had arrived without warning and without mercy, and they had brought enough ships to block out the stars. The Sarani Collective had never known war, and they had no weapons and no soldiers and no way to fight back against the predators who descended upon their peaceful agricultural world. Duran had lived for 200 cycles, and he had spent his life tending to the great orchards and teaching young ones about the history of their people. And never once had he imagined he would watch everything burn. The screaming and the signal came from the capital city where millions of Sarani had lived in harmony just days before. Now those same streets ran with horror as the Kreth hunters moved through the population with brutal efficiency. Duran had broadcast a distress call to every frequency he knew, and he had begged for help from the Galactic Council and from the trade federations and from anyone who might hear. The responses had been the same everywhere. The Morthani Empire expressed sympathy but could not risk war with the Kreth Dominion. The Velishi Consortium offered thoughts of solidarity, but their fleet was needed elsewhere. The Galactic Council scheduled a meeting to discuss the matter in 3 standard weeks. 3 weeks meant nothing when your people were dying by the thousands every hour. Duran had sent the signal again and again until his voice grew hoarse and his hope faded into something cold and empty. The Sarani had nothing to offer and no strategic value and no military alliance, and they were just farmers and artists and historians who had never harmed anyone. Why would anyone come for them? The bunker shook as another explosion rocked the city above, and dust rained down from the ceiling, and Duran closed his eyes and prepared for the end. He thought of his children and grandchildren who had fled to the northern provinces, and he wondered if they were still alive, and he prayed to whatever forces might listen that someone somewhere would protect them. The communication panel crackled with static, and Duran ignored it because he had stopped expecting answers. But then a voice came through, and it spoke in a language he did not recognize at first. Sarani Collective. "This is the United Earthship Relentless Dawn. We heard you crying. We brought friends." Duran's eyes snapped open, and he stared at the panel as if it had spoken in the tongue of ancient gods. Humans. He had heard of them in distant reports and whispered warnings from other species, and they were called Deathworlders because they came from a planet that tried to kill them every day. They were supposed to be dangerous and unpredictable and utterly terrifying, but they had come. Duran rushed to the scanner display with trembling legs, and what he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Dozens of ships were entering the system, and they were not small patrol vessels or diplomatic cruisers, but massive warships bristling with weapons that glowed with deadly energy. The Kreth fleet that had seemed so invincible just moments ago was already moving into defensive formations. Captain Yoon Seojin stood on the bridge of the Relentless Dawn and watched the tactical display with calm, steady eyes. She was tall for a human with black hair pulled back in a tight bun and a face that showed no fear even as her ship led 46 others into hostile territory. Lieutenant Commander Park My-rae stood beside her, and her fingers moved across the weapons console with practiced precision. "Captain, the Kreth are hailing us," Park said, without looking up from her station. "Put them through." Yoon replied. The screen flickered and the face of a Kreth commander appeared with his sharp teeth and red eyes and the arrogant sneer that his species wore like a badge of honor. "Human vessel, you have entered Dominion space. These creatures are now property of the Kreth. Leave or be destroyed." Yoon did not blink and she did not hesitate. "We received a distress signal from the Serani Collective. They asked for help. We are here to provide it." The Kreth commander laughed, and the sound was harsh and cruel. "The Serani have nothing to offer you. No resources, no technology, no strategic value. Why would you waste your ships on worthless prey?" Yoon leaned forward, and her voice dropped to something cold and hard. They were screaming. That was enough. The Kreth commander's laughter died, and confusion flickered across his alien features. "You would go to war for strangers who cannot repay you. We would go to war for anyone who cries for help and receives silence," Yoon said, and then she cut the transmission. Park looked at her captain with something like wonder in her eyes. "Orders, Captain. Signal the fleet," Yoon said as she straightened in her command chair. "All ships engage at will. Priority targets are orbital bombardment platforms and troop carriers. I want those Kreth off that planet by morning." The bridge erupted into controlled chaos as orders flew and weapons powered up, and the human fleet surged forward like a wave of righteous fury. Far above Serani Prime, the first shots were fired, and the night sky lit up with the light of battle. In his bunker, Daran watched the scanner display, and tears streamed down his face as the Kreth ships began to fall one by one. He did not understand why the humans had come, and he did not understand what they wanted, and he could not comprehend why anyone would fight for strangers. But they were fighting, and they were winning, and for the first time in 9 days, Daran felt something stir in his chest that he had thought was dead forever. Hope. Fleet Admiral Kwon Daesun monitored the battle from her command ship, the UES Thundering Justice, and she felt pride swell in her heart as she watched her people do what they did best. They had received the Serani distress signal 6 hours ago, and they had not waited for permission, and they had not asked for authorization, and they had simply moved. The Galactic Council would be furious, and the diplomats would demand explanations, and the politicians would wring their hands about proper procedures. Kwon did not care. She had listened to that signal with the screaming and the pleading and the sound of children crying, and she had made her choice in that moment. Some things were worth fighting for, even when the math said otherwise. Her communications officer turned to her with wide eyes. "Admiral, we are receiving transmissions from the surface. The Serani are asking why we came." Kwon smiled, and it was a sad and knowing smile. "Tell them we heard them crying. Tell them we refused to look away. Tell them that on Earth we learned long ago that silence in the face of suffering is the greatest evil. And tell them they are not alone anymore." The message went out, and across the burning world below, millions of Serani heard it and wept. The humans had come not for profit and not for power and not for any gain at all. They had come because someone was hurting and no one else would help, and that simple truth would change the galaxy forever.